Excellent. So welcome everybody to our special Q&A, because I'm not going to talk today. I'm going to ask questions. We're joined by a dear friend, a longtime rad reader, an incredible human being, polymath, thought partner, source of inspiration, rocket scientist, Mr. Ozan Varol, who's had a big week this week with the launch of his new book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist. So first, welcome, Ozan, and huge congratulations for this great milestone in your life.
Thank you so much for having me on. I just noticed, by the way, Kay, that your background says "think like a rock scientist," not like a rocket scientist.
Oh.
That was like, it's funny, when my publisher first sent me the image to include in my email signature, that was it.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I like missed it and then replaced it like the day later. So you must have this initial version.
That's funny.
Thinking like a geologist is not as sexy as thinking like a rocket scientist.
That was Google. That was all right. So let's do this.
There we go. That's better.
That was a Google. This top Google result for the horizontal picture.
Oh,
so
okay. Well, we'll need to fix that.
So all right. So let's. I'd love to kick off with just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where you're from, how you spend your time, who are the important people in your life. Give me a couple minute bio, so for our readers who are unfamiliar with your work.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Istanbul, Turkey. I grew up in a family of no English speakers, learned English as a second language, and then came to the United States by myself when I was 17 to major in astrophysics. Astronomy was like my really lifelong dream. It started at an early age when we used to have these really frequent blackouts, and my dad invented this game to keep me distracted. He would light a candle and then grab my soccer ball and like show how the soccer ball rotated around the candle, which was supposed to be the sun, and then the soccer ball, the earth. And so those were my first astronomy lessons, and I was hooked. And so I came to the US at 17, leaving my family behind to study astrophysics. And then, so I went to Cornell, and at the time, a professor at Cornell was the principal investigator for this Mars mission called the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers mission to send 2 rovers to Mars. And I ended up landing a job on the operations team of that project, and did that for 4 years, which was a lot of fun. It was what the book is basically about. And then I did a 180 and went to law school, which I'm happy to talk about why I made the transition, but I'll just give a broad overview for now. And then practiced law for a few years, went into academia, became a professor. I got tenure in 2016, and that was also the year that I launched my public platform, so blog, podcast, and started thinking seriously about writing a mainstream nonfiction book. I spent 10 years of my life writing academic articles that only like 10 other people in my very specific subspecialty read, which was fine while it lasted, but I wanted to do a lot more. And
did you have like a bestseller on constitutional law?
Yeah, I had a book that came out in 2017. That was a #1 new release on like comparative politics, comparative constitutional law. But no, I wanted to just write a nonfiction book that you can find when you walk into a bookstore. And so that journey began in 2016 and culminated in the book that came out this week.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. And like I said, I'm so excited to dig in. One topic that we have been talking a lot about in our community with this group of people is what we've been calling anti-fragile careers, right? I'm 40. This is my 3rd crisis. And if you take Nassim Taleb's language, an anti-fragility is not only something that's robust and resilient, but it's something that thrives in the face of uncertainty. I spoke at USC yesterday. You teach law students. Mm-hmm. And so I would imagine there's a lot of collective angst in this moment about graduation, about the economy, about jobs. And so through that lens and through your own body of work and your experiences with your student, what do you tell a student that says like, I'm really scared. Someone asked me this yesterday. What skills should we use to survive in this, uncertain economy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say a number of things. I'm just jotting down some thoughts here. So first would be to diversify your identity the way you diversify your investments. So we talk about diversification when it comes to financial instruments. You don't want to put all of your money into a single stock. You want to diversify across different industries. You don't want to just invest in real estate, et cetera. But most of us don't do that when it comes to our careers. For me, it sort of happened accidentally, to be honest with you. I sort of built this portfolio of things that I do. And then maybe a few years ago, it sort of occurred to me, I'm like, oh, like I have a really diversified range of things that I do that would then bode well for me in a crisis. Initially, it happened because I've always found it very interesting to dabble in multiple fields. Transitioning from rocket science to law initially, but then now branching out to like speaking and writing. It's been fun because it allows me to make combinations or connections between seemingly disparate ideas that actually are related to each other. So I can take topics from rocket science and show business leaders how to apply them in their professional lives. And so I was doing it primarily for my own interest. It's just more fun to play with multiple boxes, and then you can connect different ideas from them. But then it also occurred to me that it sort of is a good way of basically minimizing against risk when a crisis like this hits. And so, for example, and this happened to me before the pandemic, like if things aren't going well in one area of my life, so I have a blog, a podcast, I do a lot of speaking before corporate audiences, and then I have my day job as a law professor. If things
He's a
aren't
busy guy, in case you guys didn't notice.
I don't have kids, which helps. So if things aren't going well in one area, I can lean on the others, which, by the way, has helped me mitigate fear of failure as well. Because if things fail in one area, that's not the end of the world, right? If my podcast isn't going well, I can lean on the other areas because I don't depend on my podcast for survival. And it also allows me to make decisions, I think, that I otherwise wouldn't be able to make in terms of leaving something and then moving to something else. So just as an example, I actually haven't talked about this publicly, but I'm going to be shutting down my podcast. My next interview is going to be my last with Derek Sivers next week. And I don't think I'd be able to do that if my podcast was my only income, right? Like if I depended on sponsors from the podcast to be able to do that. I've been doing podcasting now for over 2 years, and it was fun while it lasted, and the topic was really interesting to me. But I've realized I'm not having as much fun as I used to, and I want to switch to something else. So diversification helps in that regard as well, because then I'm free to move, leave that behind, and go do something else. And that's something I wouldn't be able to do if I was dependent on my podcast as a sole source of income. Likewise, when the pandemic hit, I'm not doing any speaking anymore. Like that completely dried up because, businesses are out of money and they're not having these in-person events. And so that part is done now for, the foreseeable future, but I can lean on some of these other areas basically to keep me busy and interested.
It's interesting that you use the phrase identity, because I heard, as you were speaking, I heard income, I'm the money guy.
Yeah.
I heard activities, but identity was a peculiar word choice. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So the reason I mentioned identity is because we tend to, and I was doing this too, particularly when I was a lawyer, we tend to tie our identity with what we do. So we tell ourselves, we are a serious lawyer, and serious lawyers do X, Y, and Z, right? Serious lawyers don't teach yoga on the weekends. Serious law professors, if that is your identity, they don't blog about contrarian thinking or write a book about rocket science. All of that is true.
Can you tell the story? that you
Yeah,
told
yeah,
me?
sure.
This is
So,
mind blowing.
so the first week that I launched my blog, I got a phone call from one of my friends in legal academia. He's been a good friend for a long time now, and he was really worried. He said, "You are destroying everything you've worked so hard to build. Like, you are ruining your scholarly significance by launching this blog. People are going to make fun of you. Like, you are writing about things that have nothing to do with your area of academic expertise, and it's, you're going to become a laughing stock, basically." And it made me concerned, because he certainly had the best of intentions, right? He was trying to look out for me, but the type of pushback that you can get, and that, honestly, I sort of was like, oh my God, am I making the right choice by doing this, by leaving this like identity I worked so hard to build? It took me so long and so much hard work to get tenure. Why am I jumping off this cliff? And then I think I mentioned this actually, Kay, with the podcast episode that I recorded with you, but there's this poem that I love called I Will Not Die an Unlived Life by Donna Markova. And my favorite line from the poem is, "I choose to risk my significance so that what comes to me as seed can move on or can go on as blossom." And so whenever I'm afraid of making a leap, her words sort of come as echoes from my subconscious, reminding me that I've got nothing to lose and actually quite a bit to gain. And that definitely was why I jumped off that particular cliff, even with the concerns of my well-intentioned friend, because I knew I didn't just want to be a law professor for the rest of my life. And I wanted to talk to non-academic mainstream audiences, which I couldn't do with my academic job.
Did there's always this window where I can relate to that when I left. It was different and similar because I left a high profile known career with no plan. Like, I didn't even have a
Yeah.
blog. And I remember people, it was totally an identity question. I would get the text over and over again, and the text was simple. It was just, what are, and ARE was in capital letters, what are you doing these days?
Mm.
And that was, to me, such a question of identity, because I don't even know if it's true, but what I saw in that is you're lazy, you're
Mm-hmm.
crazy, you're taking an unnecessary risk, you're putting your family in jeopardy, you're entitled. I saw every flavor of identity, both mostly negative, in that, like, flashed in front of my eyes, because I had torn down the one identity that I had worked 35 years to get to accumulate. And all of a sudden I just ripped it off. And so in that, I know that we get a lot of people, one of the things I loved about your book is, one of my personal values is start before you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of consultants and bankers who read what I write in the community, and I always call it the McKinsey effect. They're like, I'm going to start a blog, and so they'll read 50 blogs about starting blogs. Then they'll like read a book on like picking a logo, and then they'll read a book about naming a blog. And then 6 months later, they give up and then move on to something else. And so in that question, though, of identity and failure, there is just like kind of just like starting and taking forward action. And you have a bunch of strategies that can help you, get over that fear, that first step. Could you share some of those with us?
Sure, yeah. So two things come to mind. And there's one more thing I wanted to mention about identity before we moved on to that.
Yeah.
But no, I completely agree with what you said, Kay. And so when what we do becomes our identity, changing what we do means changing our identity, which is a really hard sell for your ego, particularly. Because your ego is tied up around your identity, and your ego is going to kick and scream if you try to change it. And so there is another benefit to diversification, is that your identity doesn't become wrapped around a single thing. So it becomes easier to move around. Okay, so with that, now your question about like, what do we do with this, which I think is actually a way of hiding, is like, I'm going to read 50 books on how to start a blog before I actually start a blog, and how do you start before you're ready? So two tactics jump to mind, or two ideas from the book. One is, so my first chapter in the book is called Flying in the Face of Uncertainty. And so, I mean, one of the things that rocket scientists do on a daily basis is to deal with uncertainty. I mean, there's so many things that can go wrong when you go to light a rocket. There's only one right outcome, and like 1,000 things that can go wrong. And so one of the strategies that I talk about in the book is a distinction between one-way doors and two-way doors. So part of the reason why we get stuck and why we don't make a leap is because we assume, and that assumption turns out to be incorrect in many cases, that our decisions are irreversible. So if we take a leap into the unknown, if we take a new job, if we move to a new city, and things don't work out as we hoped, we assume that life as we know it is going to come to an end. That is not true. It may be true in some cases, but honestly, in the vast majority of cases, it's not true. If you have a corporate job and you leave that to start your own company, for example, in most cases, if your company doesn't work out, if your startup just doesn't work as you hoped, you can go back to the corporate world, right? And so, in other words, that decision is a two-way door decision. There's a doorknob on the other side. So you can walk into the room, see what it looks like, if you have enough savings to like quit your day job and go do this. But you can open the door, see what it looks like, and walk back out if you don't like what you see. One of my favorite stories that illustrates how that strategy might apply is from Richard Branson. So starting an airline is a really risky investment. Most airlines fail. It's also really expensive. It looks like a one-way door decision where you go in and then, if the airline doesn't take off, you lose all your money. But what Richard Branson did was to take that seemingly one-way door decision and convert it to a two-way door. So he reached a deal with Boeing that allowed him to return the first plane he bought if his airline didn't take off. So that was a way of Richard Branson saying, okay, this is a risky investment that I want to take, and I'm going to convert it to a two-way door, which is exactly what he did. So that's number one. I think that's really important to keep in mind. And it seems, I know, so intuitive in hindsight, but even I find myself like reminding myself of that on a monthly basis, that like this decision is reversible. I can come back to where I am now. The second part is about failure. So I think fear of uncertainty and fear of failure are these like two ugly twins that get in the way when we're thinking about making a transformative change in our lives. So fear of failure, of course, right? What happens, or what do we do if we fail, or what am I going to be if I fail? Going back to that identity point, am I a failure? One idea there is to keep in mind that all breakthroughs are evolutionary, not revolutionary. You're not going to get it right on the first try. I cringe when I go back and look at like my first newsletter that I ever sent out. I mean, it's so embarrassing. It was called Brain Steroids. And it was like 5 bullet points of like things I had read, and it was really ugly looking. And my first website was just horrendous. If I had waited until I was quote unquote ready, and by the way, you'll never feel ready, I wouldn't be where I am today. I mean, I still would have been waiting and spinning my wheels to try to get the idea right from the get-go. We have an obsession with grand openings, but the opening doesn't have to be grand as long as the finale is. And so the idea is to start before you're ready, and just get your ideas out there. Because I mean, one of the things that happened to me, so I spent a lot of time, months probably, trying to figure out the right positioning for my blog. What was I going to write about? What was going to be the theme? And it honestly was a waste of time because you don't know what the theme is going to be until you start doing it. It was until after I started writing that I sort of started to develop a voice, and I could connect these ideas that I was writing about into this coherent theme. But the theme came like 6 months after. There was nothing to begin with because I was completely new. Like I didn't know what I was doing. And so I think that reducing the threshold to getting started by just realizing that the first thing that you do is going to suck. And this, by the way, is like all scientific revolutions began with really messy, ugly first drafts. The first 3 launches of SpaceX were spectacular failures, which I talk about in the book. Einstein's first several proofs for E equals MC squared failed. We don't see those ugly realities almost often because, you know, you're sort of getting this like final product, which looks really polished and perfect. But gloss reflects more than it reveals. And behind that perfect gloss is a really messy story that often does not get told.
Oh, God, that gives me chills, man. The two-way door is something that I can relate to. I never thought of it that way, but you know, one thing that gave me confidence in leaving finance was knowing that I could go back. And again, it was the identity of like, the thing I was afraid of was being a failed entrepreneur asking to re-enter versus like the availability of the door itself. And even something trivial like moving to California when your family lives in New York, you don't have a network here and all that. Like people like, you can't move to New York. You know, you can't move to California. You're from New York. I'm like, I could always move back. It cost a little money. Like, and we always said it'd be a 2-year plan to move to California. You can't, you have 2 kids. You can't, you know? So I love the two-way door analogy. I'm going to use that one a lot. I'm going to ask my last question, and I know the audience has tons of questions. Cross-pollinating ideas. You're a law professor. You write, you know, to a more mainstream audience. You have this like hardcore technical scientific background. Do you have a process or a system or maybe even like an app like that helps you kind of merge together this these interdisciplinary ideas?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that question. I call it comparing apples and oranges, or like Einstein called it combinatory play, but comparing apples and oranges. Most original ideas are like recombinations of existing ideas from different disciplines. One of my favorite recent examples of this is how Netflix got started. So Reed Hastings, who's the co-founder of Netflix, he had rented, I think the movie was Apollo 13 from like Blockbuster, and he got a bunch of late fees for it. And he was pissed off, and he's at the gym one day working out. And then it just occurs to him that he can pay $30 or $40 for a monthly gym membership, and he can go as many times or as little as he wants. And and then he thought, oh, what would happen if I took this idea and applied it to video rentals? Like, seems so simple, so obvious, right? In hindsight, but like at the time, all of these giants like Blockbuster, which no longer exists, couldn't see it because they were too busy doing what they did yesterday. So combination is really important. You know, I don't have an app for this. I think what you need to do is, for you to be able to compare apples and oranges and generate these ideas, you have to expose yourself to, you have to collect the fruits basically. So expose yourself to just a diverse field of ideas. So read a book about something that you know nothing about. Like pick up a magazine on a subject that you wouldn't be interested in. And then here's the important part: you need to let your subconscious do the work. And so it often happens, and a lot of the stories I tell in the book where like people are exposing themselves to different ideas, there is a period of slack where at the end of which the epiphany arrives. So if you're constantly in hustle mode, you're moving from one thing to the other, you're busy clearing out your inbox, attending endless meetings, you're not leaving room for your subconscious to do the work of connecting these seemingly disparate ideas. And you know, in my case, so like one of the weird things I do is we have a sauna in our backyard, and I spend 20 minutes there 4 times a week with nothing but a pen and paper. I know it's kind of a really weird place to write, but some of the best ideas for like blog posts I've had in recent memory come there, because it's like I'm just completely the external world is completely shut out, and I'm just there with my thoughts. And I think we don't allow ourselves to do that. I mean, so this seems like an ideal period, right? We're all stuck at home. But most of us might be in like physical isolation, but we're not in digital isolation. Like, we're checking the news constantly. We're checking social media constantly, which is producing anxiety and really is not giving us those periods of slack that are absolutely essential to generate new ideas. As the saying goes, it's often the silence between the notes that makes the music. So you need to leave room for silence, for your subconscious to do the work.
I definitely craving some silence myself. I can hear my kids screaming right now upstairs. So, well, thank you. With that, we got about like 20 more minutes. So I want to open it. I've got hundreds of other questions, but I want to open it up to you. Just, if you can, turn on your video and fire away at Ozan.
Hey, Ozan, this is Kyle. How are you?
Hey, Kyle. Good. How are you?
Good, thanks. Let me put on video here. Thank you so much, and thanks, Kay. Good to see you, and thanks for putting this together, as always. I'm ex-Deloitte, and obviously the message of diversification is not one that is given at consultancy, as I'm sure also, obviously, in law firms. The message is to specialize, right? Specialize, specialize, specialize. And to a certain extent, college is meant to take you on that route too. So what should be the message that we need to start preaching more to folks to get them to be more open about the avenues that are available, right? I mean, that there are other adventures out there, and that the risk is not really that terrible of a risk, as you alluded to already.
Yeah, no, I do think educational conditioning plays an important role here, because we are taught, even in law schools, beginning in law school, to specialize. Like, that's how you get ahead. And that message is wrong. I think, I mean, the way that we spread the message is to bust that myth. And a book that I recommend when I hear that from people, that message of like specialization is really important, aside from my own, which I haven't recommended before, but since it just came out this week, but it's David Epstein's Range. It's a really good book. I'll actually type that into the chat here.
Cool.
But it basically makes, really, through very convincing case studies, that creating a broad range of skills, in other words, like almost specializing in being a generalist, is the best way to get ahead, and the best way to minimize risk to yourself, basically, despite what you hear at law firms or in educational institutions. And so I think that's really the best that we can do, is to spread that message.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks so much for your time. This is Kwame. Kay, thanks for putting this together. I'm curious about your newsletter, and if you could just talk through, how you've avoided social media while building your list for your newsletter.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that, Kwame. So when I started,
what year?
So this was 2016. And I was on social media. And by the way, I still have an Instagram account. I'm just not active on it. When I started in 2016, I had a limited amount of time to put into this. And so I wanted to invest in something that I knew wouldn't change. So, and for me, that was email. What do I mean by invest in something that I knew wouldn't change? So Facebook and Instagram and all of these social media platforms change their algorithms all the time. So you don't own your audience. If you're on Instagram, Instagram could make a change today, which would cause you to lose access to most of your followers. And by the way, Instagram is now making a change as we speak to like hiding like counts, which is completely destroying the business model of some influencers that depend on like visible displays of likes to be able to attract attention from potential sponsors. I wanted to own my audience. And it was a way of like mitigating risk from my perspective. I didn't want to depend on a middle person for access to what I was building. So that's why I started a newsletter. And at the time, one of the questions that I ask myself on a regular basis is, what if I did the opposite? So what if I took this like industry best standard, this common method of like building an audience, for example, and did the exact opposite of that? Instead of, which was popular at the time, spreading your energies across email, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of this stuff. What if I just picked one? The one that I thought would bring the most value to me, that would be the most interesting to me, and that would also bring the most value to my followers, and just focus on that and just disregarded everything else. And it's hard. And it's still, when I pull up Instagram sometimes, I'm like, oh, I wonder if I should be on here. And then I go back and say no, because there's a difference between what makes us feel good and what's good for what we're building. So what's good for our business, what's good for our platform. And often the two don't overlap. What makes us feel good is that hit of dopamine you get when you're seeing the number of likes on your Instagram photo. But as an author, Instagram is terrible for selling books, for getting the message out there of a book. Email is by far the best venue for that, even though it doesn't necessarily make you as good, make you feel as good as like the visible count of likes on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook might. And so that was my thought process and why I decided to focus on email to just the disregard of everything else. And I think it's worked well.
Can you talk about you're at 18,000, I think I saw?
19,000 as of this morning.
So
Yep.
it's 19,000 in 4 years. Was there, if you had to, a lot of people on this call are under 25 issues of their newsletter, and just 18,000 seems so far away. It seems inachievable.
Yep.
What would you tell them, both like as a cheerleader, and what's like one thing you might tell them tactically?
Sure. So here's what I would say as a cheerleader, and this goes back to what I mentioned before, which is the opening doesn't have to be grand as long as the finale is. I think at the end of my first year of like sending an issue out every week, so that's 52 issues, I had maybe 900 subscribers.
500 for me.
That was year one. Year two, at the end of that year, and this goes to Kay's second question about tactics. One of the things I did was to start syndicating my blog posts on other platforms. And the Next Big Idea Club, which was known as Helio at the time, was relatively new. And so I approached just cold one of the editors there, saying like, hey, like I have this podcast where it was actually initially written interviews that I was doing with people. And some of the people I had interviewed were writing for this website, like Adam Grant and Dan Pink. And so I said, can I start syndicating some of my content, like beginning with these written interviews on your site? So I started doing that. And then I wrote this article. I had written it on my blog. And like it was popular within my own followers, but nothing really happened to it. It got syndicated on Helio. They changed the title. So they always change my titles whenever I give it to them. They changed the title to Facts Don't Change Minds. Here's What Does.
What's the original?
The original one was like how to change a mind, yours or someone else's or something. Like far less sexy than that. That article ended up going sort of viral, quote unquote, whatever that means. I know everyone has like different metrics for that, but I think the last time I checked, it had like close to 500,000 views. And so that article was really a catalyst, because then at the very end of the article, I had this byline that said, if you like what you read, click here to get a free ebook on contrarian thinking. It was like 8 principles to innovate your thinking, which was basically my lead magnet. And I think I added like several thousand subscribers from that article after it was syndicated. And so I found that useful, and I still do that with the Next Big Idea Club, is to put some of my blog posts there because I'm reaching a different audience than my own. And it's a way of directing people back to my website and adding them to my email list. And so if you're just starting out, I would urge you to take a look at like what other blogs you follow, what other blogs or platforms might be willing to publish your content, because people are always looking for good articles, right? Good content to be able to publish. And so if there's a fit, reach out to them and ask. And ask them to, you know, if you can include that PS line at the bottom. And in most cases, I've never had anyone tell me no. And so that was really helpful. And that really, because once you reach like the 7,000 mark, the 6,000 mark, then it's sort of the growth becomes more organic. Then like people are telling each other, you've built up this critical mass of people, and then it just sort of builds up gradually from there. And I've had spikes every now and then, like I had a spike this week when the book was published. And so you'll have spikes like that. But once you reach that critical mass, the growth becomes organic.
And I'd add, it's excellent advice. Even it's a reminder to me, because I don't syndicate. I write so much that I could easily syndicate to all different publications, and I just don't. So a few things that I hear there from my own experience is you'll never control what goes viral. Mm-hmm. So you just have to put more, I'm not a fisherman, but more lines in the water, and one of them will hit. You're just not going to know which one it is. You'll never know, or it's pretty rare.
I completely agree with that. And let me just add, and what you said is so true. Quantity, and Adam Grant talks about this in Originals, quantity is what leads to originality. The more you're putting stuff out there, the more you're trying. And the thing is, the more you try to make something go viral, the less likely it becomes. Mm-hmm. The best articles I've written started out as like private journal entries. I had an article published in Time magazine shortly after I became a US citizen in 2016. And it started out as a private journal entry. And I showed it to my wife, and Kathy was like, you have to publish this. But I had like no intention of putting it out into the world. It was just supposed to be a private moment of reflection for me. And it ended up being one of the most successful things I've ever written. So it's one of those things, like the more you try to control the outcome, the less likely, because then you're sort of sabotaging your creativity.
Mm-hmm. Two other things that I would add, the importance of subject lines and headers. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a skill that I learned if I had learned it earlier, I'd just be further along, right? Just that little switch that they made on your headline. Your headlines, by the way, I'm going to put in Ozan's newsletter. First, you buy the book, then you subscribe to the newsletter. That's the waterfall of activities. But he has some of the best subject lines, and I have what writers call a swipe file, which is just like a greatest hits. I'd say like 10% of my swipe file headlines are from Ozan's newsletter. So he's great at headers, subject lines. And then one that I still to this day am not good at, again, Ozan's really good at, is a lead magnet. And the lead magnet it's not just like, give me your email address. It's, I will send you an ebook and 8 principles. It's like, and it's basically a reframed blog post with a veneer over it. And the veneer it's a PDF, not a URL. And so those are lead magnets. Get those out early. Like those entice people to subscribe to your email list.
Yep, absolutely. And on subject lines, let me just add one thing. Make sure you deliver on what you promise. Yes. It's one thing to like build curiosity and tension, and then actually deliver on the tension you're building, on the curiosity generation. It's something else to promise the world and not deliver. If you do that, people are going to open your emails once and unsubscribe and not look at them again. It's like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. That is very true. Credibility is really hard to build and very easy to destroy. So make sure subject lines are really important. So it's important to build curiosity, but do it in a credible way.
Yeah. Always respect your readers.
Yeah.
going to pop in with a question from Lindsay. Lindsay asked, what is the question you ask someone who views themselves as specialized to get them to think more broadly about their career and options?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things I've realized, and actually the blog post I mentioned that went viral, Facts Don't Change Minds, was around this, is that facts don't change minds. You can tell that person everything you want in terms of why generalization is a good thing. And if they believe what they believe, confirmation bias is going to kick in. And they're going to basically, in most cases, disregard what you're telling them. And so, unless there is some open-mindedness on the other side, I don't have a good answer to that. It's a really good question. And there's something that I struggle with my own students sometimes, because I can't get them to follow the advice that I give them, right? Like, I can only tell them the advice, and then it's up to them. And I can show sort of like stories always help of like success case studies certainly help in a way that like hard, cold data doesn't usually, because stories tend to really resonate with people, particularly personal stories. So I would try that, honestly. If you can share some personal stories or stories of other people who have succeeded because they were generalists, I would start there. But honestly, then it still is up to the other person to accept or reject what you're saying. And if they have, going back to our identity discussion from before, if they've tied their identity around their specialty, it's going to be really hard to change their mind.
So I want to be respectful of your time. Do you mind if we take one more question?
Sure, yeah, totally.
All right. We got one in the chat, and that is from Eunice. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm a recent grad and I've wanted to start a newsletter. How do you get over the sense that no one would be interested in what you have to say, or that you even have something worth saying?
So you're not going to know if you have something worth saying until you actually start writing. And by the way, I firmly believe that everybody in this room has something worth saying. You're not going to be able to find out what it is until you actually start writing. We often think things work in the other direction, right? You have to sort of figure out what you want to say, or what the theme is going to be, what the name of your blog is going to be, and then you start writing. It's the other way around. You start writing first, and then you discover the theme that connects your disparate ideas together. And in terms of getting in the sense that like no one would be interested in what you have to say, no one might be interested in what you have to say. So for me, in the beginning, the writing was really just like a way for me to creatively express myself, even if no one was listening, right? And so that fear is real, but you have to move past that to be able to write. And I think for me, the best remedy for this is to just start and set a consistent schedule and say, I'm going to do this for 20 weeks, right? I'm going to send out a newsletter every Thursday morning.
I tell my audience 25. That's the
there you go,
test
25.
of the medal.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you can do that, then you'll get, because then it sort of everything else becomes secondary, right? Then it becomes about your commitment to this goal that you set out for yourself. And here's the thing, like Newton's first law of motion, objects in motion tend to stay in motion, applies here as well. Once you get going, it becomes much easier to keep going. But objects at rest tend to stay at rest. Getting over the initial hump of starting and doing 20, 25 of these, and by the time you get there, you will have an audience of people following you. I guarantee you. And you're also going to actually figure out like a theme or something that connects what you're talking about. But you can't figure that out until you get to issue number 25, as Kay said.
And you'll also know if you don't like doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a very important, it's shiny new toy. Everyone wants X, Y. Everyone wants to be a YouTuber. If you knew what it takes to be a YouTuber, you probably would not want that life. Eunice, it reminds me, saw a long time ago, saw this, an 18-year-old asked Bill Gates a question about networking. And he said, you know, how would someone like me approach you who's well-read, successful, knows everyone, if I wanted to invite you to have networking? Like, what could I give you? What do I have to offer you? And he said, everyone has something to offer me, Bill Gates, which is perspective. He's like, Bill Gates doesn't know what it's like to be an 18-year-old. He can read about it. He could ask his kids, but every single one of us has a unique perspective based on, you know, the infinite amount of variables that make us who we are and what we care about. And so, Eunice, I would always remember that your perspective. I ask when I meet college students, I like social media. So I always ask them, when you wake up, what 3 apps do you check and what's the order? That's a really interesting perspective to me. They might think it's a throwaway comment to them. And so just remember that you have perspective, and with that practice, you'll be able to unleash it into the world. Awesome. Well, Ozan, I want to thank you. I've got 3 pages of notes. I'm going to turn this into a YouTube video so that people can rewatch this. I want to congratulate you for this incredible achievement, and I've learned a ton from our friendship. I've learned a ton from your book, but most importantly, I learned so much from how you kind of carry yourself in the world, which is like so much more important than the book and the newsletter and all that. So I just thank you for that, and for spending this time with us. And everyone who's watching the video, you know, go check out the book. Think Like a Rocket Scientist just came out this week. And then head over to ozanvarol.com/newsletter and subscribe to his newsletter. It's awesome.
Thank you so much, Kay, for having me on. This was so much fun. And thank you so much to everybody who joined the call. Really appreciate all the questions.
Awesome. Bye, everyone. See you next Thursday.
Bye.